Black and white photograph of a small, dilapidated cabin stands on the edge of a fog-choked forest. Its walls sag under decades of neglect. The windows stare blankly like empty eye sockets. The land around it is uneven, littered with fallen timbers and the roots of oaks that have grown wild, curling over the paths no one walks anymore. On September 14, 1882, in Catoosa County, Georgia, deputies arrived at this cabin with a report that chilled even the most experienced officers. The midwife, a stern woman named Martha Keaton, had sent word that something had been born that no living person should ever witness. According to county records, the child, later catalogued simply as Samuel, emerged without skin or flesh, a skeletal frame that somehow breathed, cried, and moved with an eerie semblance of life. An excerpt from a 1973 field journal, discovered in the archives of the Appalachian Folklore Society, reads, "I have seen many things in Appalachia, but nothing like this. Was it a curse? Or the horrors of bloodlines left unchecked?" The language is sparse, factual, but every line trembles with disbelief. Reading it, one almost feels the chill of that September evening, the fog rolling in from the river, the faint sound of children screaming in dreams no one remembers anymore. The county ledger lists the birth in delicate cursive, penned by a clerk who likely thought he had made a mistake. Samuel McCrae, male, born September 14, 1882, survival uncertain. And uncertain it was. The child lived for 3 weeks, wrapped in a blanket of moss and herbs, fed by a concoction of goat's milk and a remedy the midwife swore would protect him. On September 28, 1882, the ledger notes, "Deceased 'cause unknown," and that is all. No obituary, no gravestone, no funeral. Only the moss, still damp on the cabin floor long after the body was removed. In a 1961 interview with the McDowell Gazette, 83-year-old Lena Hartsfield said, "I never saw him, but I saw the cabin. The door was cracked, the smell, oh, it wasn't death. It was wet wool and milk gone sour. The way nursery rooms rot when no one sings anymore." Lena's voice trembles even in the transcript, a brittle thread of memory reaching back 80 years. She had been a child in the county when the event was whispered about, and she remembered the hushed tones, the sideways glances of adults who seemed afraid to meet a child's gaze. Property tax ledgers from 1882 and 1883 still list the McCrae family as active, but the census data and burial records vanish after that year. The family appears in fragments: an older brother arrested for petty theft in 1883, a sister sent to an asylum after describing a baby who sang through its bones, and a father whose death certificate notes only unknown causes, unexplained distress. These fragments create a puzzle with missing pieces, a family unmoored in time, as if erased deliberately. The midwife's account, preserved in a private collection of mid-19th century medical journals, describes the child in clinical yet poetic detail: ribs visible through thin membrane, eyes wide and unblinking, cries sharp, shrill, yet strangely melodic. It is alive. It breathes. I do not know why the Lord permits this. Even in that age, Martha Keaton understood the horror of the unnatural, the quiet shame of witnessing a life both miraculous and impossible. County Logbook, Entry 402A, records the deputy's inspection. Cabin secure. No other family present. Infant found under moss. Survival efforts ongoing. No tracks of other persons. Cabin otherwise empty. Recommend report to superior. Situation unprecedented. The language is deliberate, professional, yet the word unprecedented carries the weight of a fear the writers could not name. There are whispers that babies in that town didn't cry. Not once. Not ever. And if they did, the bells would ring. The small church on the hill, now long abandoned, would toll as though warning the world that some order had been violated. The McCrae child cried in defiance, or perhaps in warning, and the community recoiled. In letters kept by a distant cousin, the term blighted birth appears repeatedly, as though repeating the phrase might ward off recognition of what truly happened. School records from 1880 to 1885, now preserved in the Georgia State Archives, show a peculiar pattern. No children from the McCrae household were enrolled, yet one sibling appears under a pseudonym, Harrison, at the local one-room schoolhouse. The teacher, in a note dated October 2, 1883, described Harrison as pale, withdrawn, frequently staring at nothing, humming tunes no one else knows. She wasn't punished for what she did, she was punished for remembering what they made her watch. Even then, the trauma of witnessing the unnatural had etched itself into the living. And to this day the cabin remains. Private landowners occasionally report strange phenomena: a chilling wind in the summer, the smell of moss long decomposed, and the faintest echo of a lullaby in the early hours of the morning. They say the place resists life. No birds land near the chimney. No matter the season. No matter the wind. The property deeds, last updated in 1927, list the cabin as active, but with no resident. The land remembers what humans tried to forget. Historians and folklorists have debated whether Samuel's birth was a congenital anomaly, a rare case of osteogenesis imperfecta, or something far older, a ritual left behind by a family whose beliefs diverged from the church and the world. An old letter from a traveling physician reads, "The child's eyes were too knowing, too old, as though he carried memories of things not yet seen." The poetic dread embedded in that line lingers, because it raises the question every archival document seems to avoid: how much of the world is governed by what we refuse to see? Even in the smallest hints, horror persists in the mundane. The dishes left in the cabin cabinet, coated with dust and mildew, the moss still growing over floorboards, the shadows that move unnaturally when the sun strikes at the wrong angle, these are the artifacts of a life that should never have existed, preserved by nothing but the reluctant memory of those who witnessed it. The moral twist, subtle but profound, is that the fear was not simply of death or deformity, but of the knowledge that some families carried burdens unspoken, legacies of ritual and secrecy that ordinary people cannot comprehend. Samuel's life was brief, but the echo of it continues in the soil, in the letters, in the half-burned ledgers stored in the Georgia Historical Society, and in the quiet warnings of old neighbors: "Do not speak of the McCraes." And in that quiet, in the fog-blanketed valley, the photograph of the cabin remains, a frozen memory of a story almost lost, a file that was never meant to be found, waiting to be traced further into the hills, the roads, and the vanished families that history itself seems to avoid. Catoosa County, Georgia, in the late 19th century, was a place the maps nearly forgot. Hills rolled like shadows, forests stretched thick and unbroken, and the rivers wound through the valleys like silver veins carrying secrets no one dared follow. The small towns were scattered, connected by dirt roads that washed away in rainstorms and winter ice. The county courthouse, built of red brick and timber, stood as the only marker of human authority in a land otherwise dominated by isolation. By 1882, the economic pulse of the region had already begun to falter. Property tax ledgers from 1880 to 1883 show dozens of farms abandoned or listed as delinquent. Families like the McCraes lived on the margins, subsisting on subsistence crops, hunting, and whatever livestock survived the harsh winters. The timber industry had taken hold in surrounding counties, but Catoosa remained stubbornly removed, its mountains preserving more than trees, they preserved secrets. Local newspapers, though sparse, tell a story of a town slowly slipping into silence. The Rome Times and the Dalton Chronicle carried small reports: a barn fire, a missing cow, a child wandering into the forest. But nowhere did they mention the events at the McCrae cabin. It was as if the town itself conspired to erase what should not be seen. Letters from merchants in Chattanooga describe traveling through Catoosa in 1882 and remark on the weird quiet that fell over the settlements at night, a stillness that was more than the absence of people. In the town records, one finds repeated references to the old Holloway Road, a track cut through the hills but never completed. Maps from 1881 indicate it was intended to connect the eastern farms to Dalton, yet it ends abruptly at a creek, leaving the McCrae farm and surrounding properties stranded in a kind of temporal limbo. Children walking to school had to traverse these uncompleted roads, crossing fields and forests where no neighbors watched. The isolation made oversight impossible. Families could vanish and no one would notice for months. Oral histories, recorded in the 1960s by folklorist James Whitaker, recall the fear that hung over the community like fog. They didn't talk about certain farms, Lena Hartsfield remembered. Not because they were bad, not because of thieves, but because the woods themselves seemed to hum when you got close. The adults didn't say it aloud, but everyone knew the McCrae cabin was wrong. Whitaker's notes also include tales from local hunters and timbermen who swore they heard singing from empty homes, or babies crying in places no child could reach. The county jail ledgers reveal a curious pattern. Arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, livestock wandering, disputes over fences, are logged, but families connected to these incidents often vanish from subsequent census records. The McCraes are only one example. Another entry from 1884 lists a farmer named Elias Harlan, fined for encroaching on a neighbor's property. By the next ledger update, the Harlan farm is vacant, and no death or relocation is recorded. The ledger itself seems to blink, skipping years where the town's anomalies would have been catalogued. Even the natural environment contributes to the sense of dread. The forests in Catoosa were dense, with pines and oaks so close together that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. Moss grew thick on rocks and fallen logs, and the damp air carried the scent of decay and loam. Field journals from the 1920s note that certain hillsides near abandoned farms were always darker, even in clear weather. Botanists recorded that no flowering plants grew under the dense canopy, as though the land itself resisted life in spots where families had vanished or where whispered rituals had been performed. Church records from the area illustrate the tension between faith and secrecy. Hand-copied ledgers from the Catoosa Baptist Church, spanning 1878 to 1885, list regular attendance, baptisms, and marriages. Yet, under the entry for September 14, 1882, a single line appears: "McCrae child born in shadow. Pray for us." No further notes are recorded. The brevity is striking, and the handwriting differs from the rest of the document, as if written in haste or fear. One of the most compelling elements of the town's isolation is its relationship to the outside world. Letters from traveling physicians and itinerant preachers describe the journey into Catoosa as like stepping out of time. Roads were treacherous, rivers unpredictable. In these accounts, outsiders remark on the same eerie patterns: animals avoiding certain homes, children speaking in hushed tones about events no adult confirmed, and adults who looked older than their age haunted by memory. Schoolhouse logs preserved in the Georgia State Archives show an inconsistent enrollment pattern. Some children appear for weeks, months, or even years, then vanish without explanation. Teachers occasionally noted odd behavior: children humming songs they claimed to have heard in the walls, or drawing sigils in the dirt that adults claimed were just games. One entry from October 1883 reads, "Mary H. draws circles repeatedly. Says she sees things in the smoke. No other children report this. Watch and report." These logs hint at an undercurrent of fear running through the town's youth, an unspoken acknowledgement that some things could not be named. Even infrastructure reflected the county's liminality. Bridges were poorly maintained, railways never completed, and roads frequently impassable after storms. Mail deliveries were sporadic, sometimes taking weeks for messages to arrive from nearby towns. Census enumerators struggled to track the population. Field notes from 1890 describe a ghost census, in which dozens of households were visited, yet many could not provide names or ages, and others claimed residents who did not exist. The McCrae household is among those cited, leaving a gap in official records that persists to this day. The geography, the economy, and the culture of secrecy fused to create a town perfectly suited for stories like Samuel's. Every abandoned farm, every moss-covered hill, every shadowed path became part of the archive of the uncanny. The land itself seemed to harbor memories, preserving evidence in soil, stone, and timber when humans could not, or would not, acknowledge it. And through it all, Catoosa County remained a place left off the map. Not for want of cartographers, but because the town itself was hidden, layered with fog and fear, tucked behind hills that rose like sentinels, watching over the vanishing families and their whispered secrets. Every record, every ledger, every faint line in a newspaper clipping points to the same conclusion. The town's geography, its isolation, and its unremarked horrors were inseparable. The landscape did not simply contain these stories, it demanded them. As the mist rises over the valleys and the hills absorb the last light of day, the photograph of the McCrae cabin sits in the archives, waiting. And Catoosa County, left off the map and off the record, stretches beyond it, a silent witness to the lives erased, the secrets unspoken, and the shadows that linger where the roads never reach. The McCrae family, whose name appears in county ledgers, tax rolls, and midwife journals, occupies a space in history that is both factual and fugitive. They existed, yet their existence is fragmented, like a torn page from a ledger that never made it to the archive. Census records show John McCrae, head of the household, living with his wife Abigail and 4 children on a plot near the forested hills west of Catoosa. By 1882, however, the family begins to slip from the paper trail, appearing in glimpses: a mention in a school log, a notation in the church ledger, a name scratched in the margin of a physician's notebook. Each trace hints at presence, yet denies permanence. Property deeds, dating from 1875 to 1883, describe the McCrae farm in precise detail. 30 acres of sloping pasture, bordered by oak and pine, with a spring-fed creek running through it. Taxes were paid sporadically, sometimes years late, and sometimes listed as exempt, though no reason is given. The maps of the time note a small cabin at the edge of the property, isolated from the neighbors. By 1883, surveyors report the cabin seemingly abandoned, but there is no record of death, sale, or departure. The land remains, but the family is gone, leaving only whispers and faint traces. School rosters and attendance logs paint a partial picture of the children. The eldest, Thomas McCrae, enrolled under an alias at the local one-room schoolhouse, is described by the teacher as pale, hesitant, frequently staring at the window for hours, sometimes whispering to himself about things seen in the forest. Mary, the next eldest, disappears from records entirely after a brief mention in 1879. Journal entries preserved in the Georgia Historical Society suggest she may have been institutionalized in Dalton, although no admission forms survive. The younger children, including Samuel, the skeletal baby, leave a faint imprint only in the midwife's notes, the church log, and the briefest census entry. Letters written by distant relatives, discovered in a private collection in Chattanooga, provide fragmented insight. One from Abigail's cousin, dated October 1882, reads, "The McCraes are stricken. The child, it lives and breathes, yet it is not as God intended. Neighbors whisper, and yet none dare approach. Fear has fallen on the hills like frost in August." These letters, preserved on brittle paper, speak in the tone of disbelief that threads through every record from that time. The factual mingled with dread, the mundane mixed with the inexplicable. The family's entanglement with local institutions reflects both neglect and suppression. Jail ledgers note minor infractions by McCrae family members, yet the follow-up records vanish. Church logs, as previously noted, contain only cryptic references to prayers for the child born in shadow. School and medical records are similarly incomplete. A physician's notebook from 1882 lists a patient as McCrae infant, skeletal, survives 3 weeks, with a margin note, "Do not report, avoid local gossip." Even at the time, officials recognized the anomaly and treated it as a record to be hidden rather than examined. An asylum ledger, dating to 1890, records a young girl admitted from Catoosa County, under the name Harrison McCrae. The notes describe her recounting the screams of the living bones, claiming to have seen her brother Samuel move under moss in the cabin. Observers remark on her pale skin, unblinking eyes, and repetitive humming. "She wasn't punished for what she did," the entry reads, "she was punished for remembering what they made her watch." The line echoes through the archival record, a thread of horror that runs through both time and paper, connecting each surviving trace of the family. Other McCrae relatives leave equally cryptic traces. A brother, Elijah, is arrested in 1883 for trespassing on a neighbor's property. The arrest report includes a handwritten annotation, "Possibly unwell, family known for unusual behaviors." After this incident, Elijah disappears entirely from official records. Census enumerators report the farm vacant in 1885, and property ledgers note unpaid taxes accumulating over the following decade. Yet the land itself remains untouched, its forests encroaching slowly on the cleared fields, as if time refuses to recognize human absence. Folklore and oral history fill the spaces left by the missing records. Residents in the early 20th century spoke of the McCrae curse, a phrase appearing in letters, interviews, and later newspaper recollections. Children were warned to stay away from the forest's edge, where they claimed the skeletal baby could still be glimpsed, wrapped in moss and staring with hollow eyes. Hunters, logging crews, and travelers report an unnatural quiet around the former farm. No birds nesting in the old cabin trees, animals avoiding the property, a persistent chill even in summer months. Field journals and diaries, written by observers and folklorists throughout the 20th century, attempt to contextualize these phenomena. One entry, dated 1931, describes a moss-covered path leading from the cabin to the creek, noting, "Footprints appear in the morning, by noon they vanish." It is as if the land itself refuses to remember their passage, yet insists on preserving some memory in its soil. These observations, paired with census omissions and incomplete church logs, build a landscape in which the family is both present and erased, a haunting that transcends individual memory. Even modern researchers encounter gaps that resist explanation. Letters requesting information from county officials, archived photographs, and property records produce partial responses, often stating, "No files exist," or "Records destroyed by fire 1892. In each case, the absence of documentation is itself a form of evidence. A gap in time and memory, a place where reality seems to buckle under the weight of secrecy. The moral resonance of the McCrae family story lies in the interplay between visibility and absence. Every surviving record is a fragment. Every erased ledger is a silent testament. The family's existence was marked by anomalies, a skeletal child, disappearing siblings, institutionalized relatives, and neighbors who spoke in whispers. Yet the land preserves what the human record refuses to hold. The cabin, the hills, the overgrown paths, all bear witness quietly to the presence of a family both remembered and forgotten. By examining the McCrae lineage, the patterns of disappearance, and the scattered archival traces, one begins to see the contours of a horror that is systematic, generational, and tied to place. The family is less a historical footnote and more a node in a network of secrecy, where isolation, geography, and social repression converge. The McCraes were not only erased from official documentation, they were intentionally hidden from collective consciousness. The skeletal baby, Samuel, remains the most vivid image of this hidden history, but the full horror extends beyond him. It resides in every missing census entry, every incomplete school log, every whispered memory and illegible notation in the church ledger. The family's legacy is etched into the land, into the soil, and into the documents that survived only in fragments. And as the fog rolls through the hills of Catoosa County, it settles over the forgotten farms and abandoned cabins, carrying the weight of memory, the echo of lives erased, and the quiet insistence that some stories, though partially hidden, will not vanish entirely. The McCraes remain present in every ledger they escaped, every oral history that survives, and in the enduring dread that their story casts over the land. Beyond the McCrae cabin and the fog-blanketed hills of Catoosa County, there stood the small brick church that served as the spiritual center for the scattered farms and isolated homesteads. Its foundation, laid in 1872, was solid enough to endure storms, yet beneath it, in a damp and seldom-accessed basement, a different story whispered through the shadows. Hand-copied Bibles, ledgers, and notes tucked behind the floorboards revealed a doctrine that diverged sharply from the sermons delivered on Sunday mornings. Here, faith met secrecy and secrecy met fear. An entry from the church ledger, dated September 14, 1882, the same day Samuel McCrae was born, reads only, "Pray for the child born in shadow." The handwriting is hurried, almost jagged, in contrast to the rest of the carefully penned entries. Nearby, a hand-copied Bible contains marginal notes, verses underlined in red ink, annotations referencing purification, the cleansing of the flesh, and a repeated phrase, "The child is witness, not culprit." These fragments suggest a belief system that treated birth, blood, and the body itself as conduits for judgment. The rituals hinted at in these documents are subtle, understated, and sinister. Diaries preserved in private collections recount that children were sometimes isolated for observation, fed specific mixtures of herbs, and watched for behaviors deemed unnatural. One entry from 1883 reads, "The child trembles when spoken to, yet observes all. She sees what we do not see. Watch the signs." It is unclear whether these notations refer to Samuel or to other siblings, but the consistency implies an ongoing practice that targeted the youngest members of the family as objects of scrutiny and, perhaps, devotion. Church attendance records reveal an odd cadence. Families connected to the McCraes attended faithfully, yet their participation seemed performative. Notes in a visiting preacher's journal, dated 1881, describe congregants as bowed in body, distant in mind, whispering when not in the house of God. The preacher mentions hearing faint, inexplicable sounds in the basement during a service, which he attributes to rats or wind. Yet the ledger notes, wind does not make such moans. The McCrae children, especially Samuel and the siblings who survived him, were bound to these rituals in ways that were never publicly recorded. Letters from the 1920s, written by distant cousins recalling family stories, describe elaborate fasting periods, nighttime vigils, and a methodical cataloging of behaviors that were considered inherited sins. Children were tested against impossible standards, measured for their reactions to light, sound, and the presence of animals in the home. They were not punished for misdeeds but for the failure to conform to an obscure set of expectations, a doctrine that blurred the line between morality and fear. Local folklore complements the archival record. Field journals from the 1960s contain accounts of adults recalling that children would sometimes be removed to the basement for prayer, and returned hours later with blank expressions. One note reads, "She wasn't punished for what she did, she was punished for remembering what they made her watch." The phrasing recurs across multiple journals, interviews, and letters, as though passed down not in writing but in careful oral transmission. The church basement itself was a repository of these secrets. Diaries from visiting ministers describe shelves of jars containing herbs, powders, and other substances labeled in shorthand, protection, purification, observation. Occasionally, manuscripts appear that detail rites to be performed in the presence of the youngest children. Simple words, repeated incantations, candles lit in specific patterns. The archives preserve only fragments, torn or water-damaged, yet the outline of a ritualistic framework emerges, a system designed to monitor, influence, and perhaps even control. An entry from 1890, in the diary of a long-deceased deacon, describes a night when an outsider wandered into the basement. He came seeking the furnace, the deacon writes. Instead, he found the children sitting silently, watching him with eyes unblinking, lips moving in murmured recitations. We corrected them and they obeyed, yet he saw. He must never speak. This account, preserved in a brittle notebook, illustrates the combination of discipline, secrecy, and fear that shaped daily life in the McCrae household and, by extension, in the town itself. In addition to these domestic practices, the church records hint at a theological justification for the family's rituals. The annotations often cite passages emphasizing divine oversight, moral vigilance, and the notion that children were vessels for both observation and penance. The blood remembers what the soul forgets, one marginal note reads. Observe the infant, for the sins of the fathers flow through the flesh. The blending of faith, fear, and family duty created an atmosphere where deviation was impossible and compliance was the only route to survival. Reports from neighboring farms reinforced the sense of systemic ritual. Hunters and timbermen from nearby counties recall seeing figures moving at night along the paths leading to the McCrae cabin, often carrying bundles or chanting softly. Local newspapers of the time, when they bothered to report on the McCraes at all, framed the family as reclusive, devout, strange, with emphasis on the word strange. But these accounts always omit the basement, the herbs, the observations, the heart of the practice. The McCrae's rituals, as fragmented as they are, suggest a philosophy that binds family, land, and faith into a single, closed system. Children were both witnesses and participants, tasked with remembering and performing, yet shielded from understanding. The skeletal infant, Samuel, became the central figure in this doctrine, his survival and death reinforcing the legitimacy of the practices and the secrecy surrounding them. Each ritual, each observation, each note in the ledger was an act of containment, as if the family sought to trap knowledge, emotion, and horror in the shadows of their home. Even decades later, the echoes of these practices persist. Oral histories describe adults speaking in hushed tones about the way the McCraes did things, leaving uncompleted sentences and vague warnings. Modern researchers visiting the abandoned cabin note the persistent chill, the moss-covered floorboards, and the faint smell of herbs that refuse to decay. The land retains memory as the rituals embedded themselves in soil, timber, and air, a haunting archive that survives when human records fail. In examining the McCrae rituals, a clear pattern emerges: isolation, observation, and secrecy. Children were monitored, behavior was recorded, faith was codified into practice, and the boundaries between moral instruction and ritualized terror were deliberately blurred. The family, the town, and the land became part of a single system of hidden belief, a mechanism to perpetuate knowledge, fear, and control across generations. The basement of the church, once a place of whispered instruction, now stands empty, yet the pages, jars, and marginal notes remain, preserved by neglect and the attentiveness of a few who dared to record what they saw. In the silence, one can still trace the outlines of the rituals, the herbs, the hand-copied verses, the careful notations of children's behaviors. The archive survives not as law or ledger, but as a memory etched into wood, paper, and the soil of Catoosa County. And as the fog rises over the hills, carrying the scent of moss, wet earth, and herbs long dried, the rituals of the McCrae family endure, not in practice perhaps, but in memory, in land, and in the lingering unease that accompanies every trace of a faith bound to fear and secrecy. The first notice from outside the McCrae household came not from the county sheriff or a doctor, but from a teacher. Miss Eleanor Whitfield, assigned to the one-room schoolhouse on the edge of Catoosa County, wrote a detailed report to the County Education Board on October 3, 1882. The document, preserved in the state archives, describes a child who arrived at school several days after Samuel's death. The girl, Mary McCrae, barely 6 years old, appeared pale and thin, her hair damp from rain and eyes unnaturally wide. Miss Whitfield's words echo across the decades. They speak, yet their words carry the weight of sights no child should witness. Mary hums at recess in tones that make the other children weep. She draws spirals in the dirt, shapes that correspond to nothing in our lessons, repeating them until dismissed. I fear for her mind, yet I cannot separate what I see from what I hear of the McCrae household. This report marked the first formal acknowledgement by an outsider that the McCrae family's practices were not mere folklore. The teacher's observations were corroborated shortly afterward by a traveling physician, Dr. Samuel Latham, who visited the county in late October 1882 to examine several sick children. In his private journal, preserved in the University of Georgia Special Collections, Dr. Latham wrote, "Mary McCrae presents with pallor, tremors, and a fixed stare. She describes a brother, skeletal in form, who lived under moss and herbs. The family claims divine purpose in these observations. I am unfamiliar with any medical explanation and advise caution. There is an unnaturalness here that cannot be ignored." By November, the local newspaper, the Dalton Chronicle, carried a brief report. A child from the McCrae family speaks of disturbing events within the home. Neighbors maintain privacy. No intervention has been recorded. The article is terse, almost clinical, yet its existence confirms that outside attention had arrived. For the first time, Samuel's short life and the family's rituals were noted beyond the immediate circle of neighbors. Court documents, later discovered in the Georgia Historical Society, provide further confirmation of the growing attention. In January 1883, a coroner's inquest was convened to examine the circumstances of Samuel's death. Witnesses included neighbors, the midwife Martha Keaton, and 2 deputies. The transcript, though partially destroyed in a fire in 1892, preserves the key statements. Deputy James Hollis: "The infant was skeletal yet breathing. We observed signs of life, though weak. The mother and father claimed divine observation." Midwife Martha Keaton: "I followed all methods known to preserve life. I used moss, goat's milk, and prayers. The child, it survived longer than should be possible. I know not why the Lord allowed it." Neighbor Joseph Allen: "I heard the child cry at night. Not as a child cries, but as something older. I saw shadows move with the infant. I report this so the law may judge if needed." The inquest ended inconclusively. No charges were filed, no custody was sought, and no record of intervention is documented beyond the transcript fragments. The official verdict reads simply, "Death by unknown causes, observation warranted." Even in legal records, the McCraes remain protected by ambiguity and silence, their practices eluding classification or prosecution. Other contemporaneous reports, largely overlooked until rediscovery in the mid-20th century, detail additional disturbances. Letters from itinerant preachers describe hearing chants late at night, observing children in unusual postures, and witnessing adults moving silently through the woods with bundles of herbs or faintly glowing lanterns. One preacher, writing in 1884, remarks, "The McCrae household is bound by fear and devotion alike. Children act as witnesses to rites no outsider may observe. The land itself seems to resist our passage, and the forest bends to their control in ways that defy comprehension." A further document, a newspaper clipping from 1883 preserved in the Georgia State Archives, recounts a fire that partially consumed the McCrae barn. The cause is unknown. Neighbors note that the flames moved in strange patterns, sparing certain objects while consuming others entirely. Livestock perished, yet jars and herbs used in the household survived intact. The report hints at superstition. Locals suggest divine protection or curse, depending on perspective. Medical files, rediscovered in 1971 in a sealed folder marked Catoosa County Pediatric Anomalies, note unusual symptoms in surviving children. A young girl, presumably Mary McCrae, is described as having extreme pallor, tremors, and repetitive movements of the hands. The physician's notes describe an obsessive attention to ritualistic patterns and a disturbing awareness of events beyond her age. These files, never published or shared at the time, reinforce the documentation of behavior that is both natural and uncanny. Even photographs, black and white prints later found in a private collection, show glimpses of the McCrae children. In one, Mary sits on a bench outside the cabin, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed not on the camera but somewhere beyond. Shadows fall unnaturally across her face. Another depicts Thomas McCrae standing in a doorway, skeletal and thin, a figure almost entirely consumed by the dark timber around him. The images are grainy, partial, yet they corroborate every written record. The family existed in a state of observation, ritual, and fear. The convergence of teacher reports, medical journals, newspaper articles, coroner's inquests, and photographs constitutes the first undeniable acknowledgement that the McCrae household was not merely a local legend. The outside world had noticed, yet it remained powerless to intervene, constrained by geography, custom, and the subtle intimidation of secrecy. Even law and medicine failed to fully grasp or act upon the anomalies. By the end of 1883, the McCraes had receded further into the hills. Samuel had long since passed, and the surviving children were quietly absorbed into the shadows of the county. The events of 1882 to 1883, however, left a trail of documents, photographs, and oral recollections that would endure for decades, forming the backbone of the archive that folklorists and researchers would later uncover. The skeletal child, the unusual behaviors, the whispered rituals, all of it was now recorded, though often fragmented, ambiguous, and incomplete. Through these records, it becomes clear that the McCrae family story was not merely a local oddity, but a systemic, generational phenomenon. The birth of Samuel was the catalyst, but the event was embedded in a wider network of fear, observation, and ritual that defined the family's relationship with the town, the land, and the world beyond. The outside world noticed, but it could not intervene. The town observed silently, the laws recorded minimally, and the rituals continued, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. The event, therefore, is not contained in a single night or a single birth. It resides in the documents, the photographs, the journals, and the oral histories, a convergence of attention that illuminates, if only partially, the horror and the secrecy of the McCrae household. Every record confirms the impossibility of what occurred and the impossibility of fully understanding it. The child lived, the family endured, and the outside world could only bear witness, unable to alter the unfolding pattern of fear, faith, and observation that defined Catoosa County. Among the fragments of the McCrae story, perhaps the most chilling are the testimonies of those who witnessed events firsthand. People who observed the children, the cabin, and the rituals, and then vanished from the record themselves. These witnesses, whether out of fear, coercion, or circumstance, left notes, diaries, and marginalia that survive as spectral traces, hinting at horrors no outsider could fully comprehend. The first witness of record is Mary Harlan, a neighbor child who frequently played near the McCrae property in 1882. Her letters, written decades later in 1934 but recounting her childhood, describe seeing Samuel in the moss, moving like a puppet animated by some invisible hand. She writes, "I watched him from behind the pines. His bones showed through his skinless body, but he moved and cried. I ran to tell my mother. She said, 'You mustn't speak of this. They will come for you.' I never understood who she meant. I never spoke again of what I saw." Mary Harlan's letters suggest a community-wide understanding that observation carried risk. Her family, long vanished from local records, was part of the network of silent witnesses. Her recollections, typed and preserved in a collection of oral histories, reveal the unnerving normalcy of secrecy, children learning to recognize horror and then unlearning how to speak of it. Schoolhouse logs from 1882 to 1884 corroborate her account. One teacher, Miss Eleanor Whitfield, noted, "Children arrive with stories of infants alive under moss. They speak in whispers. The other children are afraid. The parents insist they have seen nothing. Observation only, no discussion." Miss Whitfield's journals are explicit in recording the fear that gripped the children, the knowledge they carried, and the adult insistence that this knowledge remain unspoken. A more disturbing testimony comes from a visiting physician, Dr. Latham, who examined the McCrae children shortly after Samuel's death. In a private diary preserved in the University of Georgia Special Collections, he writes, "The girl Mary recounts the infant as if he is still present. She describes rituals, herbs placed on the child, candles circling the moss, repeated prayers and voices not her own. Her eyes are wide, but she is quiet. I believe she sees more than I can. I am documenting, but I fear that to do so may draw attention to her, and to myself. Observation itself carries peril." This entry demonstrates an almost ritualistic cycle. Observation begets knowledge, knowledge begets fear, fear begets silence. Those who witnessed the McCrae's practices, even outside officials, found themselves implicated in the horror simply by seeing. Their accounts are meticulous, careful, almost coded, revealing what they saw while avoiding phrases that might attract scrutiny. Oral histories collected by folklorists in the 1960s provide additional glimpses. One interview with an elderly man named Thomas Keating recalls seeing a child, likely Thomas McCrae, standing by the cabin door humming a song that made the hair on my arms stiffen. Keating notes that the child's eyes were older than the moon, a phrase repeated across multiple interviews, suggesting that memory, oral or written, preserved a haunting metaphor for unnatural awareness. Even official records hint at witnesses who disappeared. County inquest documents from 1883 following Samuel's death list neighbors and midwives as attendees, Yet subsequent property deeds and tax rolls indicate that many of these families vanished within a year. One entry reads, "Witness absent from subsequent census. Property vacant. Fire, disease, migration." These are the official explanations, but patterns suggest something more systematic. Those who observed too closely or spoke too much were quietly erased from the town's living memory. A surviving coroner's note, handwritten and preserved in a brittle folder, includes the following. Mary McRae testifies to rituals and herbs. Witnesses listen. Some are silent. Some leave and never return. Observation itself may be dangerous. The note, abrupt and fragmented, highlights a moral tension inherent to the McRae case. To observe is to understand. To understand is to risk being consumed by knowledge. The McRae household functioned as both school and trap, teaching children, neighbors, and outsiders alike that some truths are too heavy to carry. Even decades later, the pattern persists. Field notes from 1973, collected by folklorist James Whitaker, describe interviews with surviving neighbors who recall that anyone who paid too much attention to the McRaes was gone before the season changed. Whitaker writes, "Stories repeat the same motif. Eyes that see too much, tongues that speak, families removed or vanished." There is no official record of these disappearances, only rumor and faint traces in tax and census ledgers. In one particularly haunting account, recorded in a 1965 interview, a woman named Agnes Fulton recalls visiting the McRae cabin as a child. She claims to have seen Samuel moving under the moss, his skeletal frame twitching in rhythm with some unseen cadence. She remembers a sister, Thomasina, who recited prayers in the basement, holding herbs and whispering words no adult should know. Agnes concludes her account, "I never spoke of it. I could not. And those who did speak, they were never seen again." Medical observations, though more clinical, reinforce the narrative. Surviving files note that children from the McRae household displayed extreme pallor, obsessive behaviors, and unusual awareness of rituals. A 1971 rediscovery of these files notes, "Observation of the household children indicates cognitive and emotional development beyond expected ranges. Statements made about rituals and deaths appear accurate. Witnesses and observers note similar phenomena. Many observers vanish from records or return changed." The cumulative effect of these testimonies is unmistakable. Witnesses existed at the margins of the McRae story, capturing fragments of the family's practices, yet disappearing from public or official memory. Whether through coercion, fear, or natural disappearance, the consequence of observation was almost always the same. The witness became part of the pattern, leaving behind only fragmented records, letters, or oral recollections. This pattern extends the horror beyond Samuel and the immediate family. Witnesses are spectral participants, caught between knowledge and survival, between observation and disappearance. They are the living echoes of the events, their experiences preserved in notebooks, diaries, and interviews, yet erased from maps, tax records, and ledgers. Their testimony confirms the McRae household as a nexus of fear, ritual, and secrecy, a place where seeing could be dangerous and understanding could be fatal. And in the hills of Catoosa County, among abandoned cabins, overgrown paths, and mist-covered forests, the memory of these witnesses lingers. Their words, recorded in ink, type, and speech, persist as fragments, guiding the modern researcher through a labyrinth of horror that cannot be fully reconstructed. The skeletal infant, the children, the rituals, they are all intertwined with those who observed and disappeared, forming a complex, generational pattern of secrecy and dread that remains embedded in the land itself. While the McRae family story persists in fragments, the town itself bears witness to a pattern of deliberate erasure. From the moment Samuel drew his first breath, certain forces, official, clerical, and communal, acted to contain knowledge, to control perception, and to silence the curiosity that threatened the family's secrets. Suppression in Catoosa County was systematic. It operated quietly, invisibly, leaving no official fingerprints, yet leaving traces that endure in marginalia, burned letters, and water-damaged ledgers. County sheriff logs from 1882 to 1884 indicate sporadic visits to the McRae property. Deputy James Hollis, whose reports survived in part, made repeated notations, "House observed, inhabitants claim divine purpose. No action taken. Witnesses advised to speak cautiously." The language is deliberate, emphasizing the necessity of discretion. The deputies, and later their successors, operated less as enforcers of law than as intermediaries between ordinary town life and the unspoken practices of the McRae household. Court records reinforce this approach. A petition filed in early 1883 by a neighboring family, requesting intervention on the grounds of child welfare, was dismissed. The judge's brief entry reads, "No cause proven. Further investigation unnecessary." Margins of the same document contain later notes in a different hand. Records destroyed by fire 1892. Witnesses unaccounted for. The erasure of documentation extended beyond accidental loss. It reflects a deliberate suppression of evidence that might have brought attention or intervention. Church authorities also played a role. The Catoosa Baptist Church, whose basement held the instruments of ritual, maintained a dual record. Public sermons emphasized morality and piety, while private ledgers and notes detail the observation and oversight of the McCrae children. A deacon's diary from 1885 reads, "We cannot allow outsiders to interpret what is sacred here. The children, the rituals, the herbs, they are protected. The law may intrude, but we shall contain knowledge within these walls." This concealment was reinforced by the community itself. Oral histories collected in the 1950s describe families who witnessed events or strange behaviors yet remained silent. Hunters, teachers, and travelers who came too close were either shunned or quietly moved away. One interview recounts a man, a distant relative, who arrived to observe the McCrae cabin and returned 2 weeks later with his memory fragmented. "I saw things I shouldn't," he reportedly whispered. "I can't remember." His disappearance from subsequent census and tax records is a recurring motif, suggesting the town's complicity in erasure. Local newspapers provide further evidence of suppression. Articles that mention the McCraes are brief and cryptic, focusing on minor incidents while avoiding explicit reference to Samuel or the household rituals. In 1883, the Dalton Chronicle published a single line, "A child of the McCrae family passes, neighbors silent." No context, no elaboration, no public inquiry. The editorial choice reflects the broader social pressure to maintain invisibility. Journalists, perhaps aware of local superstition or fearing reprisal, opted for omission over investigation. Even fires and natural disasters contributed to the erasure. The 1892 courthouse fire destroyed vital records, including coroner's reports, property deeds, and inquest transcripts. Letters from historians in the 1930s suggest that some documents were intentionally withheld before the fire, moved to private collections, or left unfiled, effectively shielding the McCraes from scrutiny. In this way, both chance and human agency intersected to create a landscape in which the family and its practices could exist without challenge. The suppression extended beyond the immediate town. Visiting physicians, preachers, and inspectors were warned, subtly or explicitly, to leave observations unreported. Dr. Samuel Latham's diary contains a single haunting line. "I fear my words, should they circulate, will endanger not only the family but those who speak. Silence becomes safety." Similarly, itinerant ministers documented rituals and observations but often concluded their notes with cautionary statements, suggesting that dissemination of knowledge carried risk. Even educational authorities participated. Teachers reporting unusual behavior, children speaking of rituals, drawing sigils or humming songs in unison, were often advised not to escalate. Letters from the county school board, preserved in part, stressed the importance of discretion. Do not alarm parents or community. Record only what is necessary. Maintain observation but speak sparingly. The message was consistent: contain knowledge, minimize visibility, and allow the town's natural hierarchy to manage secrecy. The combination of official, clerical, and communal suppression created a network of enforced ignorance. Those who might have drawn attention were either discredited, redirected, or disappeared from records entirely. School rosters vanish mid-year. Tax documents skip entries. Church ledgers are incomplete or annotated with warnings. Observation itself became dangerous, a lesson learned by witnesses and documented in journals and letters alike. Folklorists in the mid-20th century observed this phenomenon when interviewing residents. James Whitaker's field notes from 1965 describe older residents carefully navigating language. They speak in half-sentences, gesturing to points in the woods. When asked for details, they shake their heads. "We remember, but the dead listen," they say. The memory of suppression survives even decades later. This phrasing, "the dead listen," suggests that the act of recording or recounting events was understood as potentially perilous, reinforcing the culture of enforced silence. Even in the present day, physical traces of suppression endure. The McCrae cabin remains mostly hidden behind overgrowth. The church basement, though empty, contains shelves and floorboards where notes and herbs were stashed. Photographs, letters, and diaries are fragmented, burned, or water-damaged. The gaps themselves tell a story, the missing, the erased, the deliberately hidden. Suppression was not merely social, it was archival, spatial, and temporal. It extended across the land, the buildings, and the paper trail, preserving secrecy at the cost of knowledge. Through this network of erasure, the McCrae household remained protected, insulated from intervention, and partially preserved as a living ritual. The suppression ensured that outsiders would rarely understand, officials would rarely act, and the town would remain silent. The horror, therefore, was twofold: the practices themselves and the machinery of concealment that allowed them to endure almost perfectly for decades. The result is a pattern of absence as much as presence. County records list names but no deeds. Census ledgers record households but not people. Newspapers acknowledge events but omit context. Suppression in Catoosa County is as tangible as the hills and forests. It is written in missing lines, erased words, and the deliberate shadows cast over archival memory. To follow the story of the McCraes is to navigate not only a horror enacted but a horror concealed, a narrative shaped as much by silence as by action. And so the town itself becomes a witness, its silence a document, its erasures a testament. Every ledger burned, every letter withheld, every observer who vanished contributes to the architecture of concealment. Suppression was not accidental, it was a deliberate, sustained effort to contain knowledge, and in doing so, it ensured that the McCrae story would survive only in fragments, whispers, and shadows. At the edge of the McCrae property, hidden behind a tangle of moss-laden oaks and creeping vines, stands the cabin. Time has not claimed it fully, yet it wears the marks of decades untouched by ordinary maintenance. Windows are darkened by soot and dust, roof beams sag under the weight of moss and rain, and the chimney, though intact, emits no smoke. The house itself is a relic of both memory and horror, preserved by neglect and isolation, and its presence continues to evoke unease for anyone daring to approach. Photographs taken in 1987 by local historian William Keaton captured the house in grainy black and white. In one image, the front door hangs slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. A second photograph, taken from the side, shows a small window on the upper floor, where a faint outline of a figure seems visible. A child, pale and motionless, though Keaton notes that the film may have created shadows. Accompanying notes describe the smell of decay, damp earth, and a faint, persistent odor of herbs that seems to seep from the floorboards. Visitors in the late 20th century reported similar sensations. In 1999, a group of urban explorers documented their brief entry. The floorboards creaked underfoot, yet some areas seemed unnaturally silent, absorbing the sound. A journal recovered from their visit details the basement, which had long been the site of the family's rituals. Shelves of jars remain, the author writes. Powders and dried herbs. Marginal notes stuck to the walls. A child's handprint in soot, too small to be recent. We left quickly, but the feeling of being observed followed us for weeks. In 2006, a researcher from the Georgia Folklore Society attempted a systematic survey. Her notes, preserved in a private collection, described the house as structurally sound, yet morally and spiritually unmoored. She writes, "The cabin resists explanation. The floorboards are uneven, yet some areas seem perfectly level. Light falls oddly, shadows bend. There is no evidence of current occupation, yet the house feels alive. Objects appear shifted upon returning, though no one enters." Her report includes sketches of the interior layout: a main room, a small kitchen area, and a basement reached by a narrow, descending staircase. The sketches are accompanied by annotations referencing herbs, scattered notes, and the faint impression of children's markings on the walls. Accounts from those who entered emphasize a profound psychological effect. One visitor in 1987 wrote, "It was not fear of ghosts or even the skeletal child. It was a feeling that the house itself remembered, that it had absorbed decades of observation, fear, and ritual. Every corner seemed to watch, every floorboard to whisper. I left with the sensation that the cabin had imprinted its memory onto me, a residue of presence I could not shake." Local folklore supports these observations. Oral histories from the 1960s describe children seeing shadows in the windows long after the family disappeared. Hunters recount finding footprints leading to the cabin that vanish near the door. A resident in 1972 wrote in a field journal, "They say no birds nest near the chimney. No matter the season, no matter the wind. The house is waiting. Waiting for what, we cannot say." Such testimony blends fact and legend, yet the cumulative effect is consistent. The cabin exerts a presence, a form of consciousness tethered to the memory of the family and its secrets. Property records confirm the house's continued occupancy in legal terms, though never by humans. Deeds from 1927 list the cabin as part of the McCrae estate, yet subsequent tax rolls show no recorded inhabitants. Surveys conducted in the 1960s, intended to assess property boundaries, note the cabin as abandoned, structurally intact, overgrown. County inspection logs repeatedly reference it as uninhabited, yet occasional anomalies are recorded. Smoke seen rising without a chimney fire, lights glimpsed at night, faint sounds resembling murmured prayers. The architecture of the house itself contributes to its unease. The basement, where the McCrae rituals were performed, is partially underground, damp and narrow, with walls that slope inward slightly, creating a subtle disorientation. Objects left by the family, jars, handwritten notes, dried herbs, small carved figurines, remain in their original positions. Researchers consistently report that these objects are never in the same place when they return. The house seems to rearrange itself, a spatial echo of the family's secrecy and observation, as if the very structure is alive with memory. The cabin's isolation amplifies the effect. Roads once leading to it have eroded, streams overflow and wash away paths, and the surrounding forest has reclaimed much of the open land. Visitors must navigate a maze of natural obstacles before even approaching the structure. Those who attempt nighttime observation consistently report a sense of being followed, unseen figures glimpsed in peripheral vision, and a profound, inexplicable dread. In every case, the observers leave with a lasting impression of intrusion into a space that is at once abandoned and hyper-aware. Archival fragments suggest that the house itself was central to the family's rituals. Diaries from visiting ministers, letters from neighbors, and schoolhouse records repeatedly reference the basement and main room as sites where children were observed, prayers recited, and herbs applied. The cabin is more than a building. It is an archive of ritual, a repository of knowledge, and a stage upon which the family's secrecy was performed. Even empty, it continues to function in this capacity, a living memory suspended in wood and moss. Modern exploration confirms this legacy. Photographs taken with infrared and low-light cameras show heat signatures in areas where no living beings reside. Audio recordings capture faint murmurs or rhythmic tapping. Soil samples from around the foundation indicate high concentrations of herbs used historically in the family's rituals. Though no one resides there, the cabin acts as if inhabited, a physical manifestation of the McCrae family's enduring presence and influence. The house, still standing, is therefore both witness and participant. Its structure preserves the memory of ritual, secrecy, and observation, while its continued isolation ensures that the legacy of fear remains intact. The McCrae cabin, dilapidated yet persistent, embodies the intersection of geography, family, and horror, a locus where time, memory, and dread converge. Even decades later, the house exerts an almost magnetic pull on anyone who learns of it. Hikers, historians, and curious locals report an inexplicable urge to see the cabin, to walk its floors, to feel the residue of memory and fear. The land around it seems complicit. Paths vanish, sounds distort, and shadows shift. The house is not simply a structure. It is a living archive, a container of past horrors, and a reminder that some stories refuse to die. In Catoosa County, as the fog drifts through the forest and over the hills, the cabin remains a monument to the McCraes, a physical testament to their secrecy, their rituals, and the enduring horror of what occurred within. Its walls remember, its floorboards whisper. The house still stands, still wrong, and still demands observation, though those who witness it rarely remain unchanged. As the McCrae story emerges from county records, diaries, and oral histories, a broader pattern begins to surface. Samuel's skeletal birth and the family's rituals were not isolated anomalies. Neighboring counties and towns exhibit fragments of the same behaviors, the same obsessive observation, and the same insistence on secrecy. By tracing surnames, school logs, and property ledgers, a network of families emerges. Families who, like the McCraes, operated in the shadow of ritual, control, and fear. Census records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal clusters of families in Chattooga, Walker, and Whitfield counties whose names recur in association with unusual child mortality, sudden disappearances, and undocumented births. The Holloway, Ashcroft, and Talmadge households, for instance, appear repeatedly in school rosters, tax ledgers, and midwife journals, each entry a fragment, a hint, a breadcrumb in the pattern of secrecy. Property deeds list homesteads as occupied, despite no record of census inhabitants after certain years. In some cases, the land remained legally attached to the family for decades, even when all human occupants vanished. Local field journals from the 1930s and 1940s provide glimpses of continuity. A folklorist visiting Whitfield County notes, children from several families appear to engage in similar behaviors, drawing spirals in the dirt, chanting songs, and moving in near-synchronous patterns. Observers report unease, a sense of preternatural understanding. The rituals are not identical but share an underlying structure: observation, recording, and repetition. These parallels suggest that the McCrae household was part of a broader regional phenomenon, one that may have existed for generations, passed silently along bloodlines and neighbors alike. School records offer further corroboration. Miss Eleanor Whitfield's logs from the 1880s note the recurrence of certain behaviors beyond the McCrae children. Talmadge girl hums patterns during lessons. Holloway boy arranges stones in repeating spirals. Parents insist all is normal. Observation sheets from visiting inspectors record extreme pallor, unusual awareness of rituals, and repetitive, seemingly symbolic actions. In every case, adults within the families reinforce silence, correcting children or redirecting attention when outsiders inquire. The pattern becomes undeniable. Observation and ritual were both inherited and enforced, not confined to a single household but dispersed across a network of interconnected families. Oral histories from older residents deepen the sense of repetition. Interviewed in the 1960s, an elderly woman named Lenora Pratt recalls playing near multiple households, observing children who acted too old for their years, whispering in strange voices, knowing things they could not have learned. When asked about her own family, she hesitated. We all kept the rules. The patterns. It wasn't just the McCraes. We all did what we had to, or the eyes would find you. The language reflects not merely observation but fear, a generational understanding that deviation invites consequences. Archival materials reinforce these connections. Letters from itinerant ministers and doctors, preserved in private collections, repeatedly reference multiple households in the region. Visited Holloway and Ashcroft properties. Children demonstrate behaviors similar to McCrae case. Herbs, hand-copied notes, and whispered prayers observed. Families insist it is divine. Observation by outsiders discouraged. Risk of exposure high. Medical records, recovered in a sealed folder from the Georgia State Archives in 1971, describe children exhibiting unusual awareness, repetitive movements, and heightened memory retention of events linked to ritual. Files are often incomplete, annotations cryptic, yet the similarity across cases is striking. Observers consistently note a quiet, systemic preservation of knowledge. Children are not punished for misbehavior, only for remembering or revealing what they witness. Physical spaces associated with these families echo the McCrae cabin. In Whitfield County, a Holloway farmhouse contains a basement with remnants of herbs, jars, and hand-copied Bibles similar to those found in the McCrae church. In Walker County, an Ashcroft property exhibits unusual architectural choices. Narrow hallways, low ceilings, and enclosed rooms, seemingly designed for observation and control. Journal entries from researchers in the 1980s note a chilling detail. In every household, the youngest children are seated or confined in specific areas, with adults continually monitoring posture, gaze, and actions. The repetition extends to auditory patterns. Field recordings captured in the 1960s note chanting, humming, and low murmurs at night, always faint, always indistinct. Researchers report that the tonal patterns resemble each other across households, yet no single recording matches another exactly. It is a local dialect of ritual, transmitted orally through repetition and through enforced observation. In addition to physical and auditory patterns, the genealogical record suggests a concentration of surnames, bloodlines, and shared heritage. Property transfers frequently involve cousins, in-laws, and distant relatives, consolidating families in proximity. These networks of kinship reinforce both secrecy and ritual. Children learn from multiple adults, and knowledge is transmitted horizontally and vertically, creating a continuity that spans generations. Newspaper archives, though largely sanitized, provide cryptic evidence. Articles referencing the Holloways or Talmadges often note unusual behaviors, reclusive habits, or children removed from school for observation, yet the stories are brief and elliptical. Court records echo similar omissions. Inquiries into unusual deaths or disappearances are inconclusive, dismissed, or lost in courthouse fires. The erasure is systematic, ensuring that only fragments remain to reveal the larger pattern. Taken together, these fragments establish a disquieting truth. The McCrae household was not an anomaly. Across Catoosa, Chattooga, Walker, and Whitfield counties, families engaged in similar rituals, raising children in strict observation, recording their behavior and enforcing silence. The skeletal birth, the herbs, the chants, the marginal notes, they are part of a broader regional pattern, one whose origins predate written records and whose effects continue to ripple across the land. Even decades later, echoes persist. Children in the 1960s and 1970s were observed drawing spirals in the dirt, humming unfamiliar hymns, or lining up objects in patterns reminiscent of archival photographs. Local residents speak of a quiet vigilance, a learned awareness that some things must remain unseen and unspoken. The pattern is both enduring and adaptive, transmitted through memory, bloodlines, and behavior, rather than fully codified texts. The evidence is cumulative. Census records, tax rolls, field journals, school logs, letters, photographs, and oral histories converge to reveal a network of families bound by secrecy, observation, and ritual. The pattern is systemic, generational, and meticulously preserved. Each household is a node in a constellation of hidden practices, extending the horror beyond the McCraes and into the broader Appalachian landscape. And so, as the fog settles over the hills, as moss reclaims the paths, and as old cabins crumble yet endure, the pattern emerges clearly. The McCraes were never alone. They were one family in a wider web of secrecy, ritual, and observation, a pattern that persists, hidden in archives, oral histories, and the landscape itself, waiting to be traced by those who dare look closely. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, traces of the McCrae legacy, once confined to black and white photographs, faded journals, and burned letters, began to resurface in modern contexts. What had been contained, isolated, and carefully suppressed now emerged in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Children repeating patterns long forgotten, families whispering old prayers, and local residents encountering phenomena that mirrored the century-old rituals. The past, it seemed, had never truly ended. In 1998, a teacher in Catoosa County submitted an unusual incident report to the school board. A 10-year-old boy, whose family traced its lineage to the Talmadges, was observed drawing spirals in the dirt playground during recess. He hummed an unfamiliar melody while moving pebbles in precise sequences. The teacher, unsure of the significance, documented the behavior. The patterns are intricate, deliberate, and repeated exactly each day. Parents claim it is only play, yet the boy seems compelled, almost ritualistic. Though the report was filed, it was never shared publicly, quietly stored in school archives, unexamined until decades later. Similar occurrences were documented in neighboring counties. In Whitfield County, 2003, a young girl named Clara Ashcroft was found sketching sigils in her bedroom. Her father, unaware of their historical context, noted that she refused to explain them, yet described them as instructions. Mental health records, rediscovered in 2012, note that Clara exhibited a heightened awareness of ritualized behavior, often repeating sequences she had never been explicitly taught. Psychologists observed patterns reminiscent of archival notes from the McCrae and Holloway households. Online forums and local social media posts from the 2010s indicate that these phenomena are not isolated. Parents recount finding children arranging objects, chanting quietly, or drawing complex patterns resembling historical ritual symbols. Some dismiss it as play, others sense something older, an inheritance of behavior that transcends conscious instruction. Reddit threads and Facebook groups preserve fragments of knowledge, often anonymized and fragmented, echoing the historical suppression while simultaneously documenting its persistence. In 2016, a group of amateur folklorists revisited the McCrae cabin. Using infrared and night vision equipment, they recorded faint heat signatures in rooms where no living occupants were present. Audio recordings captured low murmurs, chants, and rhythmic tapping, aligning with descriptions from 19th century journals. Soil samples collected near the foundation revealed residual traces of herbs historically associated with the McCrae family rituals. The physical space itself, though abandoned, remained a conduit for the family's memory and influence. The resurgence is not merely behavioral but also auditory and visual. Residents report hearing faint hymns at night, especially on fog-laden evenings, echoing the patterns documented by itinerant preachers in the 1880s. Children recount vivid dreams or involuntary recitations, echoing lines from hand-copied Bibles once used by the McCraes. These modern occurrences suggest that the family's rituals were encoded not only in memory but also in the landscape and the objects they touched, persisting across generations. A particularly disturbing 2019 police log in Walker County documents an incident involving a child drawing spirals on school walls. The officer's notes include, "Child claims to teach the house. Parents unaware of meaning." Behavior mirrors historical patterns described in archived field journals regarding McCrae and related families. No criminal activity, but psychological evaluation recommended. Even in legal and educational frameworks, the echoes of the past manifest, showing that the patterns established over a century ago are active, adaptive, and unbroken. Medical case studies provide another dimension. Pediatric files from 2015 to 2018 describe children exhibiting ritualized behaviors, heightened observation, and obsessive repetition. Annotations note that in some instances children speak of older siblings, or the Moss child, invoking figures long deceased including Samuel McCrae. These modern occurrences suggest a transgenerational transmission of both knowledge and behavior, unrecorded in textbooks but persistent in family memory and community folklore. Genealogical research further corroborates the return. Families with surnames connected to the original McCrae network, Ashcroft, Holloway, Talmadge, and Harlan, have documented lineage continuity into the 21st century. In interviews conducted by folklorists and local historians, descendants recall stories told in hushed tones, warning children never to speak of rituals or the cabin. These warnings, though fragmented, suggest that the behavioral patterns were deliberately maintained, encoded, and transmitted, waiting for conditions that would allow them to resurface. The modern phenomenon extends beyond physical observation. Digital records, photographs, and social media create a networked echo of the original suppression. Posts, often anonymous, recount inexplicable phenomena at old family properties or while hiking near abandoned cabins. Users describe children, sometimes strangers, exhibiting behaviors that mirror historic rituals, chants, drawings, arrangements of objects, and unexplained knowledge. Though these accounts lack formal verification, their consistency and geographic clustering suggest a continuity of the pattern. Even in urban environments, traces appear. Descendants who have moved to cities report recurring compulsions, dreams, and drawings resembling those documented in archival records. Psychologists note obsessive repetitive behaviors, heightened attention to ritualized patterns, and an unusual awareness of ancestral spaces. Some families report that children speak of things in the hills, or the Moss child, echoing terminology preserved in field journals and oral histories. These signs indicate that the McCrae pattern is not confined to geography but transmitted genetically, socially, and culturally. What emerges then is a startling realization: the past never fully recedes. The rituals, the observations, and the compulsions of the McCrae household persist, adapting to modern contexts. Children, descendants, and community members unknowingly reenact behaviors documented in journals, letters, and photographs from more than a century ago. The network of families, once isolated, now exists within a living continuum, unbroken, evolving, and reasserting itself. In every account, historical or contemporary, the story is consistent. Observation, ritual, and secrecy form a pattern that endures, transmitted through family, memory, and environment. The McCrae legacy is alive, manifesting in behaviors, dreams, and unexplained phenomena. The past and present intertwine, suggesting that Samuel's short life and the family's rituals were never merely historical curiosities. They were catalysts for a living, generational phenomenon that continues to unfold in the hills and homes of Appalachia today. The return is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Children hum the same melodies, draw the same symbols, and move with the same deliberate precision as those recorded in 1882. Homes remain focal points for ritualized observation, even when abandoned. Descendants inherit not only names and property but behaviors and compulsion, echoing patterns that predate formal record-keeping. The past lives again, silently, shaping present behaviors in ways that defy explanation. Throughout the investigation of the McCrae family, one recurring phenomenon emerges: the uncanny persistence of a name. Across centuries, counties, and generations, the family surname, McCrae, appears in fragmented records, often in unexpected ways, as if the act of speaking, writing, or remembering it carries a subtle, almost supernatural consequence. The name itself becomes an archive, a cipher through which history and horror intersect, and whose repetition seems to summon or rewrite events across space and time. County archives reveal early evidence. In Catoosa, 1882 property ledgers list the McCrae homestead, yet successive entries are strangely inconsistent. At times the property is marked as vacant, at others as occupied by McCrae heirs. Census data from 1890 is absent, destroyed in fire, yet tax rolls in neighboring Whitfield County continue to record the McCrae name in incremental notations. McCrae Thomas, present, McCrae Mary, present, McCrae property monitored. The repetition is methodical, deliberate, and anomalous, as if some part of the record itself resists erasure. Legal documents amplify this anomaly. Court cases spanning decades, ranging from minor disputes over property lines to inquests into deaths and disappearances, contain references to a McCrae signature, sometimes identical across files separated by years. One 1921 probate record in Walker County features a signature indistinguishable from that of an 1883 inquest document. The handwriting, perfectly consistent despite the intervening decades, defies natural explanation and suggests either forgery, spectral continuity, or some form of inherited imprint. The phenomenon extends to medical records. Pediatric files in the 1970s and 1980s, previously discussed in relation to ritualized behavior, often note the McCrae surname when recording familial history. Yet in several cases, these records correspond to children born in entirely different towns, to families that claim no direct relation. The recurrence of the name in clinical and legal contexts suggests a linkage that transcends simple genealogy, hinting at the name itself functioning as a locus of pattern, ritual, and memory. Photographic evidence compounds the sense of inevitability. Archival images of the McCrae cabin, schoolchildren from neighboring counties, and family portraits all feature faint, almost imperceptible annotations of the surname. One photograph, taken in 1965 by folklorist James Whitaker, shows a young girl in the window of a Walker County farmhouse. On the back of the photo in an unknown hand is inscribed, McCrae Watches. The note is undated and signed, yet perfectly legible, a ghostly intervention that situates the name across time, geography, and observer. Oral histories, too, underscore the peculiar influence of the surname. Residents in Chattooga, Walker, and Whitfield counties recount whispered stories passed down through families. "You don't say McCrae aloud," one interviewee explains in a 1963 field recording. "If you do, the stories get longer, people disappear, and the house remembers." Children report writing the name in drawings, often accidentally, yet the act triggers immediate adult correction or admonishment. Observation and utterance become acts of consequence, connecting behavior, memory, and the uncanny persistence of the family identity. Digital traces, though modern, mirror this historic continuity. In online forums and genealogy discussions, users who input the surname McCrae frequently experience strange anomalies: posts disappearing without explanation, repeated echoes of the same anecdote, and images of historic properties seemingly linked to the family. Some descendants report inexplicable dreams of ancestral homes, moss-covered cabins, and children they have never met. The digital record becomes a contemporary analog to the archival persistence observed in paper and ink, suggesting that the name continues to carry memory, awareness, and influence. Even linguistic analysis reveals the name's peculiar behavior. Across field journals and oral histories, the surname appears with subtle variations: McCrae, 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 but always in contexts that replicate core elements of ritual, observation, and secrecy. Whether in legal documents, letters, or school logs, the name functions as a bridge, connecting disparate households, generations, and counties. Every utterance seems to reinforce the network of practices established by the McCrae lineage, allowing the ritualized patterns to persist, survive, and adapt. Folklorists have noted the cognitive effect of the name itself. In interviews conducted with children and descendants of connected families, mention of McCrae triggers vivid recall. Drawings, chants, behavioral repetition, or sudden attention to patterns and objects. The response is involuntary, immediate, and consistent across unrelated individuals. It is as if the name carries encoded instruction, a mnemonic vessel for the rituals, observations, and secrecy cultivated over more than a century. Even physical records reflect the phenomenon. Archival papers, when stored together, sometimes manifest anomalies: ink smudges forming the name spontaneously, marginal notes added without identifiable handwriting, and document sequencing that appears to realign according to the presence of the surname. Researchers report unease while handling these records, a creeping sensation that the papers themselves are aware, subtly shifting to maintain continuity of the McCrae memory. Historians investigating these anomalies are compelled to acknowledge an uncomfortable reality: the name is not merely an identifier. It functions as an anchor in time, a conduit for ritual, and a mechanism by which memory, observation, and secrecy persist. Across counties, households, and generations, the name enforces connection, encodes instruction, and ensures survival of practices that might otherwise have been lost. In every case, the repetition of the name triggers pattern reinforcement, linking past to present, observer to observed. The effect extends to modern observation. Visitors to the McCrae cabin, explorers of abandoned homesteads, and even casual hikers report a heightened awareness when the name is mentioned aloud. Some claim to see fleeting shadows in windows, hear whispered chants, or feel the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The name functions almost as a key, spoken, written, or thought. It activates a network of memory embedded in the land, the structures, and the objects left behind. Thus, McCrae becomes both a label and an active agent. It is not merely a surname, it is a conduit, a transmitter of behavior and memory, a repository of ancestral knowledge, and a symbol of enduring ritual. Speaking it, writing it, or even observing it is to engage directly with the network of families, practices, and suppression that spans centuries. The records themselves, fragile and incomplete, seem to respond to the presence of the name, rewriting the narrative, preserving fragments, and ensuring continuity of both horror and secrecy. Across time, the McCrae name persists in records, photographs, journals, oral histories, and even digital spaces, binding observers to the legacy of ritual, observation, and concealment. To encounter the name is to confront a lineage of knowledge and fear, to witness a continuity that defies natural explanation, and to recognize that some histories are not written. They endure, alive in memory, space, and behavior. The McCrae name, in its repetition and persistence, functions as both a warning and a key, a warning that observation carries consequence, and a key to understanding the enduring network of families, rituals, and patterns that began long before Samuel's birth and continues to manifest in the present day. It is a name that cannot be forgotten, a record that cannot be fully erased, and a thread that connects past, present, and perhaps unknowable futures. The final pieces of the McCrae narrative resist closure. Unlike conventional histories, this story does not conclude neatly. Records are missing, fragments burned, and memories scattered across generations. The landscape itself participates in concealment. Hills, forests, and abandoned cabins preserve silence, obscuring the full truth. Even as we attempt to trace the family, their rituals, and the enduring network of behaviors, the story resists comprehension. Some things were never meant to be understood. County archives, where available, end abruptly. Tax rolls, once meticulous, omit entire households without explanation. Death certificates, when they survive, are often anonymized, citing causes like natural complications or unknown congenital disorder, concealing the extraordinary events that occurred. Letters, diaries, and field notes, whether burned, water-damaged, or secretly hidden, suggest deliberate intervention, guardianship of knowledge, enforced silence, and a conscious shaping of memory. The McCrae story and the broader regional pattern it represents exists partially in fragments, and those fragments carry the weight of suppressed horror. Physical evidence mirrors archival gaps. The cabin, still standing, preserves traces of ritual, observation, and memory. Basements retain jars of herbs, hand-copied texts, and faded inscriptions on the walls. Floorboards creak underfoot, yet return no echoes of recent occupation. Objects shift mysteriously between visits. Moss-covered paths, once cleared for access, reclaim themselves with uncanny speed. Those who enter feel an awareness, as if the house itself remembers all who have crossed its threshold. The building is both witness and participant, encoding practices and behaviors across time, a physical repository for memory too dangerous to be recorded openly. Modern manifestations continue. Children trace spirals in dirt, hum forgotten melodies, or sketch symbols they do not recognize. Psychological studies, though sparse and incomplete, note behavioral patterns remarkably similar to those documented in 19th-century journals. These occurrences, often dismissed as coincidence or inherited quirks, align so consistently across geography, bloodlines, and generations that skepticism falters. The past is not past. It endures, quietly, adapting and resurfacing under conditions that remain poorly understood. Even the land participates in this quiet persistence. Catoosa, Whitfield, Walker, and Chattooga counties contain properties, woods, and hills that retain subtle, unnerving anomalies, unexplained footprints, shifting shadows, and sounds that defy explanation. Hunters and hikers report distant chanting, the rustle of objects moved by no discernible hand, and a sense of being observed. Field researchers note patterns that seem deliberate, objects aligned, markings repeated, and traces of ritual behavior echoing historical accounts. The environment itself serves as an archive, preserving the knowledge and presence of the McCrae network beyond human intervention. Fragmented oral histories underscore this persistence. In interviews collected from 1950 onward, residents recount fleeting glimpses of children, shadows in windows, or encounters with people behaving with unnatural precision. Descriptions of rituals, chants, and observational behaviors match archival records almost exactly, even decades later. The stories are repeated with care, often in half-sentences or cryptic gestures, as if full disclosure might summon consequences. In these accounts, memory and fear converge, preserving fragments of truth while enforcing silence. Genealogical research continues to reveal connections. Descendants of families associated with the McCrae network, Ashcroft, Holloway, Talmadge, and others, appear across multiple counties. Bloodlines converge in certain households, and surnames persist even as direct records vanish. Children in these families inherit not just names, but behaviors, rituals, observation patterns, and responses to stimuli that echo historic events. The family legacy, whether consciously recognized or not, continues to operate as a living system, encoded in memory, practice, and environment. Even digital records cannot escape the pattern. Social media, forums, and online genealogy databases occasionally register echoes of McCrae-related phenomena. Photos with inexplicable anomalies, posts deleted or altered without explanation, and reports of children behaving in ways consistent with long-documented rituals. Technology, far removed from the 19th century cabin or the church basement, inadvertently preserves fragments of behavior, reinforcing the pattern across time and media. The past adapts to the present, leaving traces for those paying attention. Psychologists, folklorists, and historians studying these phenomena struggle to find conventional explanations. Behavioral repetition, ritualized observation, and transgenerational transmission of knowledge all suggest mechanisms beyond ordinary genetics or culture. The recurring appearance of the McCrae name, the persistence of objects and architectural layouts, and the uncanny reproduction of rituals across families and counties indicate a continuity both human and, in some sense, environmental, a network of influence woven into memory, space, and behavior. And yet, as extensive as the documentation may appear, there remain unfillable gaps. Entire diaries, tax rolls, and letters were destroyed or hidden. Witnesses disappeared. Field journals contain half-sentences, burned margins, and cryptic references to unseen forces. Attempts to reconstruct the full story only reinforce the incompleteness, highlighting the deliberate and accidental suppression that has governed the McCrae narrative for over a century. Some files, some names, and some occurrences will never be known. The McCrae legacy, in its persistence and partial concealment, is both horrifying and profoundly human. It exists at the intersection of memory, behavior, landscape, and secrecy. It reminds us that some truths are too dangerous to fully reveal, that observation itself can propagate patterns across generations, and that certain histories, though erased or obscured, leave an indelible mark on people, families, and land. Even today, explorers of the old counties report an uncanny sense of being watched, objects subtly rearranged, and children acting with an awareness that seems inherited rather than learned. Researchers feel a weight in the air when studying surviving documents, a quiet insistence that the story cannot be fully grasped, that certain knowledge remains forbidden. The ending is not tidy, not resolved, and not comprehensible, because it was never meant to be. To this day the McCrae cabin stands. The surrounding hills remain dense with forest, obscuring paths and erasing footprints. Objects within the house subtly shift, and faint traces of ritual persist in the soil, walls, and air. Children, descendants, and observers continue to exhibit behaviors that echo past patterns. Records, when they exist, are fragmentary. Stories, when told, are cautious and incomplete. The network endures, human, environmental, and archival, a reminder that some stories are not only historical but living, breathing, and impossible to fully capture. The files, the houses, the children, and the names converge in a mosaic of absence and presence, memory and suppression, continuity and disappearance. Samuel McCrae's brief life, the skeletal child who lived without flesh, becomes more than a singular horror. It is the node around which generations, families, and landscapes have rotated, leaving traces, echoes, and shadows that persist to the present day. And so the record remains open, incomplete, and fragmentary. Each diary burned, each ledger erased, each witness silenced reinforces a legacy that continues to operate quietly, adapting and recurring across time and place. Some things we were never meant to know. Some patterns cannot be broken. And some names, once spoken, carry a weight far greater than we can measure.